Good evening. Started looking a little bit about Jonathan last week and kind of getting that character in our mind. I think it's important that we do that. Think about what the writer's trying to portray in Jonathan, right? Because this is really his introduction into the story. Jonathan's been around. Jonathan's a man by this time, but the writer of Samuel didn't see the need to interject him into the story until this particular pivotal moment when Jonathan and his armor bearer leave the camp and go into the camp of the Philistines. And Jonathan looks to God. We talked about this last week. Looks to the Lord to give him a sign. And when God does, Jonathan goes up with his armor bearer and he slays about 20 men within a half a furrow in an acre of land. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. You know, I think what you see is a lot in this introduction. We talked quite a bit about that last time. We want to see Jonathan as strong. We want to see Jonathan as victorious. We want to see Jonathan as very God-oriented, God-centered. He wanted God to make a decision, looked for God in the decision. But the other thing I think as you get to the bottom of this is what the writer of Samuel wants us to see is that not only was Jonathan godly, but that God knew Jonathan. You know, there was a relationship here. The earth trembled, right? Who made the earth tremble? Right? God made the earth tremble. Why? Because Jonathan had looked to God. Jonathan had done what God wanted to do, and God was giving him recognition for what Jonathan had did. So, you know, I think as we move through the story, you're going to get a lot of different ideas about Jonathan. You're going to get a lot of different thoughts in your mind about what kind of man, what kind of character Jonathan really was. But I think in this introduction, the writer of Samuel, he wants to present him as a strong, victorious, God-centered individual. I don't think his character is going to change. Our perception of his character may change, but his character is going to be this is the man that Jonathan is, and that's what the writer of Samuel wants you to understand going into this. This is the man that Jonathan is. You know, we talk about character traits, right? What makes you you? What makes me me? What is our character? You know, that's a really interesting subject sometimes. Not just what do I think my character is, but what do you think my character is, you see? Because character traits tend to follow us our entire life. Would you agree with that? Character traits tend to follow us our entire life. Matter of fact, when I counsel people in marriage counseling, one thing I always ask them to do is write down 3 character traits about the person they're marrying and write them down and put it in an envelope and seal it up. And I say one day in your marriage, when you wake up and you're dissatisfied for whatever reason, and you think, well, that person is whatever, I said, take that envelope out and open that envelope and read those 3 character traits of that individual and ask yourself, is that still the same person you married? Because it is. You know, because character traits tend to follow us throughout our life. Basic character traits. So if you were to list on a piece of paper what your character traits are, whatever that might be, dedicated, hardworking, loyal, compassionate, those are character traits. Those are things that ultimately define who we are in the end, I think. And those character traits can be good and they can be bad, right? We can have bad character traits, right? As well as good character traits, right? Just as much as we can be dependable, we can be undependable, right? Just as much as we can be compassionate, we can be uncompassionate, right? So character traits really are something we have to think about. And when people are getting married, I always look at those traits, and I always ask them those questions too, and I say, what attracted you to this person? You know, I think that's important. What attracted you to this person? I remember I was counseling some people one time, and this guy said, well, you know, what attracted me to this woman was her her compassion and her desire to help other people. And I said, well, what, give me some examples of that. How does she do that? And he said, if somebody calls, she's there. I mean, she'll stay and take care of them. She'll nurse them back to health. She'll take care of their kids. And I said, does that ever make you feel kind of maybe a little bit left out? He goes, well, sometimes. And I said, how's that going to play out when you're married and she wants to go and take care of somebody else or go and take care of somebody that's sick or be gone? Character traits can attract us to someone, but also those very traits in the end can embitter us towards that same individual. You understand what I'm saying? Because you can't take a caring, compassion that's going to go do that. If that's their character trait, chances are when you get married, it's not going to change that. And the very thing that maybe attracted you to them, that compassion and that ability to care and that ability to help, that very thing in a marriage eventually could allow you to become embittered against them because you feel like they're taking care of everybody else and not you. Do you understand what I'm saying? So character traits become very important in our lives and our ability to manage those traits. And I speak from experience because certain character traits that I possess at times is very annoying to my wife. I mean, I'll just be honest about it. It really is. And I understand that. But at the same time, a lot of those things that annoy her are a lot of the reasons that she loved me to start with. And that's difficult, right? Those are things we have to manage in a relationship. We have to find a way to manage those traits in a relationship. So I think when you look at Jonathan, and if you were to look at him and say, what was his character traits, I think in the beginning of this beginning of this process, you really see who Jonathan is. Jonathan's strong, Jonathan's victorious, Jonathan's a leader, Jonathan's godly. All these things are coming into play, right? But these are traits that's also going to embitter his father against him. So as we go through the story, it's important that we keep in mind the person that Jonathan is. Now, one of Saul's character traits, what do we know about Saul, right? Let's just read a little more. Saul's watchmen in Gilbreth of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. And Saul said to the people who were with him, number now and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan, his arm bearer, was not there. And Saul said to Ahiah, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God is at that time with the sons of Israel. While Saul talked to the priests, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. Behold, every man's sword was against his fellow. And there was a very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously went up with them all around the camp. Even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard the Philistines had fled. They pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread. Now you get a picture. So let's get a picture. So we see Jonathan. Jonathan went and did what Jonathan did, and Jonathan's victorious. But Saul's king, right? Saul is king. Now there's some things we're going to learn about Saul, right? And that's Saul's character traits, okay? So Saul's character in this story, there's something you're going to begin to see that's going to follow him throughout this whole process, and that's jealousy. Saul's a jealous individual. That's a character trait. Jealousy is a character trait just as much as any other character trait that you possess. Jealousy is a trait, right? You know people who are extremely jealous, and you know people who don't seem to be jealous, right? Jealousy is not something I think you choose to be jealous. I think jealousy is a trait. Jealousy is a trait like any other. People who are jealous, what causes jealousy? What inferiority complex, right? Why are you jealous? What makes you jealous? You're not, maybe you don't measure up. You're not as trusting, maybe, a person, right? You don't have a tremendous, maybe, amount of trust if you're jealous, right? You think that, right? Maybe you think that you don't have as much to offer, like Buck said. It's an inferiority. right? I don't feel like I have as much to offer as another person has to offer, so I'm jealous of that person, jealous of ability. I don't, you know. Right, because you have that complex. Right. So people who are extremely jealous, a lot of times that can sometimes relate to a feeling of inadequacy. Would you agree with that? Inadequacy, right? If I'm jealous of somebody else, if I'm jealous of my wife with another man, which I never really have been that, but if I ever was, it would be because I would feel like maybe he was superior to me, or right? And I would maybe feel jealous towards that. So jealousy is a trait, and Saul's a jealous person. One thing, Saul's in a lot of power, and when you're king, you think that people ought to go through you. But what did Jonathan do? Did Jonathan go to Saul, go to the king, go to his dad, and say, "Dad, king, I want to go over and fight these Philistines"? Did Jonathan do that? Well, how does Saul feel about that, you see? Saul feels a little betrayed, doesn't he? Jonathan should have came to me. I'm the king. I'm the leader of the battle. Right. I'd have to back up to look at that, but I think you might be right. Yeah. But not only was he betrayed, but he was betrayed by who? Betrayed by his son, right? I mean, it's one thing to be betrayed if you're a king, but it's another thing to be betrayed by your son. And if you were King Saul and your son Jonathan had snuck off to go kill the Philistines, you might think a little bit different about it than if you were Jonathan doing that. Am I right? Because Saul ultimately is kind of responsible. And what if it had gone the other way? What if Jonathan had been killed? What if it had let the Philistines, you see what I'm saying? Well, what if he would have been proud of him? But do you think you as a father, you as a king, where would you stand on that? Would you be proud of him for taking off on his own and fighting the Philistines, or would you be mad at him for doing it without you knowing, you see? Not if you're jealous, right? So here's this great plain. Huh? Well, now you're getting a little further on in the story on that order. Yeah. We're not quite to that yet, but we will be. So you see God, I mean, there's things going on here, and you know, I think when we get into the meat of this, I just want you to back up and look at things from different views, you know, not just look at it from this one perspective, but put yourself in Saul's place as king, right? How do you feel about this? Put yourself in Jonathan's place. You know, how do you feel about this? There's a lot going on, right? There's a dynamic in this. And so you got this great plain of battle where they fought that. This is where this is. And, you know, we know this place is still, you know, under war, right? Basically today. So Megiddo is a great plain, the great battle plain. Those who believe, premillennialists believe that's where the great battle's going to be. But that great big plain where they fought, because it was wide open and they could run chariots in the plain. It was wide open. It's a big open plain, so they can run chariots in the middle there. There was a lot of battles, a lot of biblical battles were fought on this plain of Megiddo. Still exists, of course, today. That's a picture of it. The men of Israel were hard pressed, for Saul had put the people under an oath, and this is where you're getting. So we're getting into the bottom of this, right? Put another oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. All the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard. when his father put the people under the oath, therefore he put out the end of his staff that was in his hand to dip it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. And one of the people said, your father strictly put the people under an oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food today. So the people were weary. How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they had found? For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. So, what you're getting in the story is that, Saul made a bad choice, right? If he would have said eat it, then they would have had a lot more strength. But because he said didn't, they didn't. You kind of see it when it says Jonathan ate it, his eyes brightened, right? I mean, he got his strength back, right? I mean, that's what that means. He got his strength back. He got his vigor back. But he didn't allow him to do this. So Saul made a bad call, but Jonathan, of course, didn't know. That's what you were talking. This is kind of where you are getting, where you were talking about. Jonathan didn't. What's that?
Because if they saw him do it, they could have said, hey, don't do that. Your dad Saul put out an order, and you didn't hear it. It's like they did it on purpose.
Right. Well, it was, I think, once again, you got to get back to the beginning of the story. Jonathan's kind of gone rogue here, right? I mean, Jonathan's kind of gone out of the bounds of his father, right? You kind of see it at the beginning. He took off on his own. He took the armor of his own. It says there was a great confusion, right? They're routing the Philistines. So Jonathan is kind of gone to a rogue state. Saul makes a really bad call here. And you see that in the story. Saul's made a really bad call. The people were very weary. Why? Because they haven't eaten. They didn't eat anything, right? So on one hand, Saul was, why did Saul say don't eat? Why do you think Saul would say don't eat anything today? Trying to fast, right? Trying to gain God's favor. What's the problem with this whole story? I mean, what's the problem with this? Didn't ask God. Once again, Saul's doing this for Saul. Saul's not doing this. Saul's doing this for Saul. He didn't ask God. God didn't tell him to fast. Saul told him to fast. He never asked God's opinion. He never asked what God thought he should do. He just decided that's the way to do it, and that's what he was going to do, because guess what? I'm king, right? But the problem is God made him king, and Saul forgets this along the way. And when he makes this oath, puts out this command, he basically curses his own son in this. The people rushed greed upon the soil, took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. That's the other thing. And what's one thing they weren't supposed to eat? Blood, right? But why did they eat it? Because they were starving. Because Saul put them in a bad place. This king put them in a bad position, didn't he? They were starving to death. So they just ate it because they're starving. They're hungry. And they told Saul, saying, behold, the people are sinning by eating with the blood. And he said, you have acted treacherously. Roll a great stone to me today. Saul said, purge yourselves among the people and say to them, each one of you bring me his ox or his sheep and slaughter it here and eat. Do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So all the people that night brought each one his ox with him and slaughtered it there. Saul has so overstepped his bounds as king here. Saul has stepped out of his lane. He just has. And, God's already turned away from him. It's setting the story. It's setting up who Saul is. Saul's selfish. Saul's jealous. Saul's character is not pure. Saul's character traits are not great. And it's going to play out. God knows it. And once again, Saul built an altar, That's not Saul's place. I'm just, Saul's out of his lane here. Do you see it? Saul stepped out of who Saul's supposed to be. You say, well, what's this got to do with us? What's this got to do with me and you? Well, it's got a lot to do with us. Because throughout history, when it comes to God, man has stepped out of their lane. And I don't know how else to put it. We've stepped out of what we should do. We've stepped beyond what God said we should do. Where God said we should be, we just stepped out. We stepped over. And it's hard to come back once you step over that line. Once you step over that, it's just hard to step back in line. And we've done it. Because why? Because we don't understand our place. Saul didn't understand his place. You know, we have to understand our place with God, who we're supposed to be as Christians, as individuals. And when we step out of that, then we have a real problem. And when leaders step out of that, we have a real problem. People who lead, who speak, who teach, need to stay in their lane. Just do. You know, I don't know how else to put it. If you don't approach it with humility and love and God's word, you're just in a bad spot. This has application to us and to our lives, what we do. If you look at what goes on here, it said, do whatever seems good to you. So the priest said, let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him on that day. And Saul said, draw near here, all of you chiefs of the people, and investigate. See how this sin has happened today. For as the Lord lives, who delivers Israel, though it is Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But not one of the people answered him. I think the problem with the whole story is that why did God not answer? Now, in Saul's mind, the reason God didn't answer was because somebody had eaten food, because Saul said, don't eat food. But if you really look at the story, right, why is God not answering? You see, why does God not answer? Because of what a command that Saul gave, or because of Saul? You see, do you understand kind of what I'm getting at here? Saul overstepped. Saul built an altar. Saul made a say. It's not till we get down past the altar, all the way past this, where it says the priest said, let us draw near to God here. Why wasn't the priest in the beginning of this narrative instead of the end of this narrative? Why wasn't God in the beginning of this narrative instead of in the middle of this narrative? You see where Saul, and now Saul has made a statement that he should never have made. He said something he should never have said. Not really, because he wants to know whether they should keep pursuing the Philistines, whether they should keep going after the Philistines. Now he wants God to tell him. Now he wants God to say, yes, you should go. Yes, you should go. But guess what? God's not saying anything, you see. And because Saul should have started with that instead of ending with that. You see what I'm saying? Saul didn't put God where God needed to be. And so we get down to this point in this narrative, and now Saul says, well, the reason that God's not answering is because somebody ate food. Somebody broke the command that I made. And he said, as the Lord lives. So he makes this great statement, as the Lord lives. And if you really look at 39, that's God's name right there. That's the tetragrammaton. Anytime you see L-O-R-D like that in capital, that's the name of God. That's not Adonai or Eloheinu or any of those other God names. That's like saying God's name. As sure as God, name of God. Swearing on God's name here. This isn't a slight statement. This is a big statement. Because what did the Ten Commandments say? You shall not take the what? The name of your Lord thy God, right? In vain. This is God's name. Now we don't even know how to say it anymore, but trust me, Saul knew how to say it. This is God's name. And he said, as the Lord lives, delivers Israel, though it is Jonathan, he shall surely die. So he's basically condemned his own son without knowing it, right? And then he said to Israel, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. So Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, give a perfect lot. So basically he's telling God to show it. Give a perfect lot. Show us who. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, and the people escaped. And Saul said, cast lots between me and Jonathan my son. And Jonathan was taken. And Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. You know, once again, if you really look at this story, Saul made so many mistakes. You know, I mean, you just can't get away from it. For one thing is, why didn't he just ask Jonathan I mean, I don't think Jonathan would have withheld it if he would have asked him, because that's not the character of Jonathan. That's not who we already saw. That's not who Jonathan was. And yet now he wants God to make this decision. And Jonathan told him, I taste a little bit of hand in my staff, is in my hand, and here I am, I must die. Do you see? Do you see Jonathan? Do you see Jonathan's character and Saul's character? Do you see when Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him, was Isaac okay with it in the story? Yeah. No, he didn't. No, if you really look at the narrative, he accepted it. I mean, he was accepting of that idea that I'm the sacrifice. I'm going to be the sacrifice. And I think when you look at this and kind of in parallel, Jonathan's okay with it. I mean, Jonathan's like, that's what you said. I mean, that's what's going to happen. I must die. I mean, Jonathan, that's the kind of guy Jonathan was. Like I said, you got to look at these traits of these characters. And Saul said, may God do this to me and more. For you shall surely die. More also, for you surely die, Jonathan. But the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance? Far from it. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. And Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. You start to see how this is playing out here? Who's lost control? Saul, right? I mean, that's a mutiny, right? They defied the king, right? I mean, Saul's lost control here. Saul's a jealous person. When jealous people lose control, what's probably going to happen? Bad things, right? So
God already gave the Philistines into their hand by Jonathan. So if Saul was asking for something that God had already given him through Jonathan, who was faithful and confided in God and relied on God, and he didn't even know it had already been done. Right?
well, it had been done to a point, but Saul wanted to know if God wanted him to continue to pursue them. You see, so basically the battle had been won. This battle had been won, but Saul wanted to know if God would let them pursue them, continue the battle, follow them back.
What should he have done? Asked the priest.
Well, he should have put God in it from the beginning. I mean, Saul messed this up. Saul messed this up from step one, right? I mean, Saul messed this thing up from the very first step. And once he did, it just continued to go in the wrong direction. Is what happens in our life. It continues to go in the wrong direction because he started wrong. As Christians, we often do the same thing. We have things we have to consider or whatever. And even in the church, I feel like we do the same thing. And I don't mean to be critical of that. I just think it's human nature. When we, like now, So now we're looking for a youth minister, right? Right? Now we're looking for a youth minister. So look at the story. So when you're looking for somebody like that, what's the first thing we should do? Absolutely, right? We should seek God's guidance, right? I mean, absolutely. That's the first step in anything we do, is we seek God's guidance. We seek God's counsel. And then, if we truly seek God's counsel, then we have to be willing to do what? Accept God's answer, right? Gary said it best. I prayed for my kids my whole life to marry the person that they should marry. And like Gary said, when they marry somebody, then you need to accept God's answer, right? I mean, you can't look at that person they marry and say, oh, well, that's not who I picked, right? You have to accept. If you've been praying for it their whole lives, when they marry somebody, then you as a Christian, you have to what? You have to believe that God sent them, right? Don't you? I mean, I think you do. How else can you do it? There's no other way to do it. There's no other way to do that as a Christian. You have to do it that way, right? Don't you agree with that? Don't you agree with what I'm saying? So when we seek God's counsel and we seek God's guidance and we seek God's answers, then we have to accept them, whatever that might be, because we have to have the faith that God's given us what we need. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't sin. I'm just saying, when we put God, and that's really when Jesus says, if you pray, would your Father give you a snake? Would he give you a stone? Right? If your earthly father knows how to give good gifts to his children, then how much more would your heavenly Father know how to give gifts to his children? Right? So when we look at that and we seek God and we seek what we should be as Christians, then we have to put a formula in place that follows our faith. And the formula that follows our faith is we put God first in any decision in our lives, whether that be a church decision or a personal decision, and then we go from there. Because, Roy said it, right? What would Jesus do? Well, when Jesus was on earth in the flesh, what was one thing that Jesus always did? He always asked God, didn't he? He always counseled with God, didn't he? And over, he said, it's not I that do it, I do what the Father tells me to do. Isn't that what he said over and over and over? He says, I speak what the Father tells me to speak. I do what the Father tells me to do. Right? So when you look at that, what would Jesus do? Well, the first thing Jesus always did was he sought God's counsel. Right? And so I think that's a big thing. And I think it flows into so when we're looking for this youth minister, you and I, as Christians, when that announcement's been made, part of our prayer should be to help our elders decide to find the right person, right? And then when they find that person and they bring him here and we hire him or whatever, then you and I, as Christians, if we've been praying for it, we need to accept God's answer, right? Because that's how we should operate. That's how we should live. So we should be praying about this. And if you're not, you need to be. Your elders would ask you. Your elders have been praying about it, I promise you. And your elders would encourage you to pray and have said it, but maybe not strongly as I would say it tonight. Pray about it. Put God in it, right? And that's what Saul failed to do in this. When Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel, he fought against Saul's enemies on every side, against Moab, the sons of Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment. He acted valiantly and defeated the Amalekites and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan and Ishvi. So there's other sons, right? 2 daughters, right, who are going to come into play later, Merab and Michelle. And the name of Saul's wife. So we get into this lineage. Kish the father Saul, Ner the father. So you're kind of, this story, when you get to this part, he's kind of summarizing Saul. Saul was victorious. Saul had a lot of victories. Saul did a lot of good things. This is who Saul was. This is how this worked out. But Samuel comes into this point because after you get into this summary of Saul, the summary, God's already turned away from Samuel. We know that. And then Samuel comes into here, and Samuel says, but you're still going to be God's tool to accomplish this task, even though God's turned away from you. Why was Saul, so we just read, okay, so let's back up a little. So we just read of Saul's successes. But I think when the writer of Samuel gets to 15, he kind of qualifies a lot of it and says, okay, Saul, you did a lot of really great things because God needed you to do it. In other words, God was just using you to do what God needed to do, right? It wasn't so much that you're the great great king, great warrior, great fighter, but God used you to accomplish what God had needed to accomplish. And then we get to this stage, and this is where Saul is really, really going to mess up. So, but I hope by now, we're going to get into 15 tonight, but I hope in your mind now you see why Saul's going to mess up. Right? Because you should start to understand Saul's character here. Saul's destined to fail right here. I mean, if we learned anything about Saul up to this point, it's that Saul's destined to mess this up. Right? Because we kind of know Saul's character now. We kind of know who Saul is. And it's going to play out right here. So, you know, there's lessons in this about us. You know, what is your character traits? If you had to sit down tonight and write 3 good and 3 bad character traits, I've done this, trust me, I don't like my bad ones. If you were to write 3 good and 3 bad character traits down about yourself, and just really think about that and think how that's impacted the decisions you've made and where you're at right now in your life, it's true. I'm just telling you, right? So, because we all have things we all have traits that follow us throughout our life. I believe that. I believe we can control them. I believe through God we can modify it and control it and make it better. But I still believe all of us have certain traits in our life that kind of move us in a certain direction. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but write that. If you think of it, if you really put yourself to it, write it down and kind of see where it leads you. You know, just be honest with yourself. And if you really want to be honest, which is the harder thing to do, ask somebody else to write that. Ask somebody that's really close to you to write down your character traits, and see how they perceive you as an individual. Not just your view of yourself, but what's people that are really close to you, what's their view of you? Huh? Yeah, on a good day. Ask them on a good day. Yeah. So I hope it kind of gets you thinking anyway. So we'll talk more about, but I hope when we get to here, you're going to say, oh yeah, Saul's going to mess this up, because I know now who Saul is, and Saul's going to mess this up. Yeah.